Yes, our topic at hand is how to become the person that your dog thinks you are. And last week we took a look at this idea that, what do our dogs think that we are? Those dogs that have caring and attentive masters create, perhaps in our own minds, but hopefully in their minds, that we are not just that way with them, but that we are that way everywhere, and that who we are to our dogs, or who our dogs think we are, makes its way into the rest of our lives. And I don't know about you, but I can sometimes live a compartmentalized life. Men happen to be more like this than women, though that's what I read, but how can I answer that fully, because who knows? But I think as a matter of fact, as human beings, we tend to compartmentalize our lives. I'm this here, I'm that here, I'm that here, I'm that here. And maybe sometimes you have to be that way in different parts of your life. But the question is, what's the thread that connects it all? What connects who I am in all the different facets of my life? I always love it when when I'm downtown somewhere. I would sometimes go into New York City when I was a pastor outside of New York City, and I'd bump into somebody, it's hard to imagine bumping into somebody in Midtown Manhattan, but sure enough, I'd bump into, a business person, let's say, walking with his or her associate, and oh my goodness, Pastor Steve, and then all of a sudden you see the wheels going on inside of their mind, like, okay, I got to connect this guy with this guy. This guy doesn't even know I have a pastor, and now I've got to somehow connect the dots between that part of my life with this part of my life. And so I think that's fundamentally part of the great challenge of our own spiritual journeys is, how do I live an integrated life, right? How do I connect the dots? How do I weave this thread through my life in such a way that I am becoming more and more the person I wish to be, my dog thinks I am, and can we rearrange the letters in that word dog? What do you get when you spell dog backwards? You still get man's best friend. Can we imagine becoming the person that God thinks we are? Now, we say a lot about, we want to become the person, we want to become the person that God wishes us to become. But the truth of the matter is, God, I think, scripturally, biblically, God knows we are that already. Why? Because we are created in God's image. So our aspiration to become like God, or to become like what our dog thinks we are, is something that we don't necessarily have to go reaching for, as much as we have to understand ourselves and how we are wired and how we were put together in our mother's womb by the Creator. The Creator creates us in a certain way to experience life in its fullest way. And I think part of the generosity journey that we're sort of focusing on here is trying to get in touch with the person that we already are, right? Because the truth of the matter is, there are lots of forces in our life and in our world that wish to mold us into something that we're not, right? We can, come up with a long list of what those forces are that make us into more and more the person we're not, as opposed to freeing us to be the person that we are. And I think generosity is a perfect example of that, because I think God creates us to be generous. God creates us to experience life to its fullest, and part of living life to its fullest is experiencing the joy of generosity, of giving away. But it takes this journey of getting further in touch with who we are and whose we are to cross that bridge over to a free and joyful life of being generous. Now, I'm not just speaking about being generous with your money. I'm speaking about being generous with yourself, with everything that you are. Being generous with your spirit, being generous with your time, being generous with your talent. All those things that when we experience it, when we experience that generosity, we experience that deep and abiding joy that God intends for us to experience. You know, it's no mistake that after Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden, that the first story that follows that is the story of Cain and Abel, right? And Cain and Abel is not a story of generosity, right? Cain and Abel is a story of jealousy. It's a story of envy. It's a story of why is God like yours and not mine? And it's a story that ends in terrible, terrible pain. Cain is marked by that experience. And he has to live the rest of his life wandering through the world almost alone because he chose to not be who he was. He was a creature of God, and he had not freed himself to be that which God had made him to be, and instead chose to allow the forces, the petty grievances, the insecurity, whatever it was, to make him not into who he was. I love the story I read in the newspaper many, many, many years ago, and it just struck me about this woman. I read it in a local newspaper. I can't remember where the local newspaper was from. Rosemary Pritchett and her family of 3 children had several downturns of luck, such that they had lost their home and were forced to live in a homeless shelter. Things were getting worse instead of better. So what should happen but that she finds on the sidewalk a check made out for $400 and endorsed. An endorsed check. Yes. What is a homeless woman to do? Pennies from heaven. $400 would cure a lot of ills for her and for her children. What does she do? She does the right thing. She calls the owner and returns the check. Always bet on the right thing, she said to herself. Always do the right thing. She knew that from her faith in God that was the right thing to do. So when Cheryl Wood saw this homeless woman return to her her check that she could very well have cashed, she could not stop thinking about this person who did the right thing. The honest gesture moved Cheryl, and it wasn't long before she had organized 70 volunteers from her church to obtain the deed to an abandoned house and to spend weeks and weeks and weeks to recondition it and to welcome Rosemary Pritchett and her family into this newly furbished home. Now, it's a wonderful story, and it's a wonderful story of joy because, one person did the right thing, and one person did the right thing, very different right things that conspired into creating this amazing experience of joy. Now, the thing about the church and us talking about doing the right thing is that we can get in trouble when we do that because doing the right thing can sound like legalism. Like, you're here to do the right thing. Let me tell you what the right thing to do is. And it's often heard that way by people within the church. Oh, I don't go to the church because It's, don't do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this, toe the line, blah, 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 blah. And it feels like legalism. And I think we're mostly to blame for that. I think we convey that message often that way, do the right thing. But the truth of the matter is, I think underneath all of this effort to aspire, to become, is this reality and truth that we are seeking to become what we already are. And so that when we are given the challenge to aspire, when we are given the challenge to do the right thing, it's simply an invitation to become more of who you really are, right? And so when we talk about generosity and we wonder about the challenge that's before us of what does it mean to be a generous person, I think if you're like most human beings, I think you guys are mostly like human beings. If you're like most human beings, we kind of play the negotiating bargain game. Like, okay, you want us to be generous? How generous do we have to be? Like I said at the beginning of the last class, hold on to your wallet, Martha. He's coming after our money. When the truth of the matter is, the call for any aspiration in our faith is, I think, a call for us to wonder about who is it that God thinks we are, and how can we more and more live into that. You remember the story about the two brothers who were farmers. This is an old story, been around for a long time, but that doesn't keep me from sharing it with you today. The two brothers who were farmers on the same farm, they farmed the same land, shared equally in the work and the proceeds. Each had his own barn where he stored his grain. One of the brothers was married and had a large family. The other brother was single and lived alone. One day the single brother thought to himself, it isn't fair that we divide the grain evenly. My brother has many mouths to feed while I have but one. I know what I'll do. I'll take a sack of grain from the granary every evening and put it into my brother's granary without him knowing it. So every night when it was dark, he carefully carried a sack of grain and placed it into his brother's barn. Now the married brother thought to himself, it isn't fair that we divide the grain evenly. I have children to care for me in my old age, and my brother has none. I know what I'll do. I'll take a sack of grain from my granary each evening and put it into my brother's barn, which he did. Each morning, the two brothers were amazed to discover that though they had removed a sack of grain the night before, they had just as many as before. One night, in the middle of the night, they met each other between the barns, both carrying a sack of grain. And they realized what had happened, and they embraced. And it said that a light rain began to fall, and they were the tears of God, because finally two brothers had gotten the point. That's a story that talks about who we are, right? That fundamentally, as good as we feel about that story, is pointing us to something about how we are knit together. We are knit to be this, and we are knit to discover that reality of ourselves if we but free ourselves to take the journey toward becoming the person that God thinks that we already are. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that journey of becoming this person that God thinks we are, and that our dog thinks we are. And I want to begin with that reminder from last week about, we talked about Mr. Lawrence and his sort of metamorphosis through the experience of Little Women. And we talked also about Charles Dickens and his metamorphosis over the evening before Christmas, and how at the end of it, the line was that his own heart laughed. I want to talk about how do we get to this laughing heart. How do we become the person God thinks that we are? And again, kind of taking a look at our own reality and what are the pressures that work on us. The Chronicle of Philanthropy found that households earning between $50,000 and $70,000 gave 7.6% of their discretionary spending to charity, while those earning over $200,000 gave only 2.8%. I think there are studies after studies that show that the more money you have, the less percentage you give away. And what does that indicate? It indicates forces, right? It indicates the forces that are about us that are, kind of going back to the Adam and Eve story, that are there to conspire to lead us to become people that we're not. The more money you have, the more things you think you have to have. I don't know about you, but every time I look out my door, I see another 2 or 3 boxes from Amazon. And those boxes are sort of symbolic to me, like, wow, do I have to have this? Do I have to have it? And I think the thing that conspires in us is that because I have this, it means I should have this. I worked hard, I made a lot of money, therefore I should have this. And that's a very subconscious message that goes on in our minds that allows us that leads us to become less and less generous because we are not cognizant of those forces that conspire against us. When you were young and growing up, and the latest thing that came out, whatever that latest thing was, whether it was a toy or a doll or whatever, something electronic these days, to be sure, there was this pull, right? I have to have this. I have to have this. And it's very seductive and it's very powerful, and it leads us away from the experience of giving. Spending gives us one fix. Giving gives us an entirely different fix. And when we pay attention to what those fixes are, we have a better sense of what we need to do in order to embrace the fix that I think God intends for us to have. $124,000 of income a year, $124,000 of income a year puts a person and household, puts a household in the top 1% of income in the world. 1%. Get 100 people up here, line them up. If you make $124,000 and above, you are at the top of the top. But it's interesting when I talk to people about their financial well-being, how often we sort of in our own minds want to downplay that. There's not many people who own the fact that they are in the upper class. They always say, well, I'm middle class. Or they often go back to their childhood and say, well, I'm lower middle class. My parents didn't have any money. But they haven't necessarily dealt with the reality that they truly are at the top of the top of the heap. I'm not saying everyone here makes $124,000. Everyone knows what I make, and I make more than that. So, but there's something that goes on in the brain that says, well, you know what? I don't have as much as other people do. And that's a force that works, that gives us the excuse not to be generous. It's like, well, I sure hope that so-and-so steps up because he's really at the top of the pile, when the truth of the matter is most of us, if we're not in the top 1%, we're at least in the top 5% of the world. And we have to be cognizant of how that force works against us. So with all that in mind, how do we aspire? What do we aspire to? The traditional way that the church views generosity is the biblical, Old Testament biblical standard of a tithe, that we are to give 10% of what we have away. In the Scripture, it was 10% to the temple. It wasn't just charitable giving everywhere. It was 10% to the temple. And then the offerings were that which was given above and beyond the tithe. So when we talk about tithes and offerings, we're talking about that minimum 10%, and then offerings to sort of be above and beyond that. Now, when people hear that, what do they hear? They hear rule, right? They hear obligation. They hear not going to be me, not going to happen. And what they don't hear is invitation to become who they are. It is a goal and aspiration for us to become the person who can experience the great joy of generosity. I have a friend who was a preacher, one of my mentors, one of those people that Sarah was talking about, who's now gone, who lives with me every day. And he preached a sermon once called, "Give Till You Get Joy." I love that. Give till you get joy. Become who you are by allowing the goals that are before you, and in particular in the church, the tithe, to be a journey toward joy, to be a journey toward creativity. We had a reverse offering a couple of times in this church. Some of you may not have been around when we most recently did it, where we had an overabundance. The generosity of our congregation was above and beyond, and it usually is. I feel in some ways when I talk about generosity, I'm preaching to the choir, because this congregation has been very generous. And we exceeded our budget in giving, and so one of the thoughts we had was to take what we had received in abundance and give it back to the congregation to give to whatever they wished to give it to. And it wasn't a lot of money. I mean, we'd be handing out $100 bills, basically. And it was so fun because it was free money in their minds. It was free money to give to whomever or whatever they wanted to give. And they were so joyful over that experience. And, you know, for many people, it was like, oh, $100 isn't enough. I'm going to times 10 that and make it $1,000, and I'm going to give it to such and such an organization. Thank you, Pastor Steve, for getting me to think that way. Well, that's inherent, I think, in this gift that God gives us, which is the gift of giving that allows us to get to the point of experiencing that joy that God intends. So, what does one do? How does one counteract the forces that are about us? How does one become intentional around this journey toward generosity? And I think that it all begins with the time we spend in Thanksgiving. The time we spend in Thanksgiving. I have kept in the past, and I know others of you have kept, a gratitude journal that allows you the chance to sit down and line after line work on a list of those things for which you're grateful. I don't think you can have generosity outside of Thanksgiving. I think Thanksgiving always precedes generosity. When you spend the time to think about, and again I'll refer back to Sarah's sermon, to think about all of what has been put into you, all the fortune, not money, all the fortune you have received in the journey that you've taken, the people who have touched you, the folks that invested in your life. When you spend time amidst those, what's it say in Hebrews 12, that great cloud of witnesses, and begin to internalize what you have received through those people that have touched and invested in your life. At least for me, it cannot help but make me ask the question, what then must I do? What then can I do in response to what has been done for me? If you go into my office, I've got a table I forget what it's called, but some fancy name for this table. I'm not good on furniture. And on top of it is this gallery of pictures. And it's kind of messy, and some people notice it, other people don't. But it's all the people that have touched my life, that have invested in my life. And it's very prominent for me, and it's a place where I get to stop every single day and just look at their faces. It's my parents, it's my brothers, it's my wife, it's my daughter, it's my teachers, it's my professors, it's the pastors who invested in me. I've got this huge gallery of people that I get to stop in front of every day and seek to, again, internalize all of what they put into me. Not because I deserved it, right? I mean, the real deep vein of thanksgiving is when you get in touch with those things that have been done for you, not because you deserved it. One of the real roadblocks to generosity is when we get onto this little thing where, well, I worked hard for my money. I deserved every cent I got. And sure enough, already, it's I. I'm holding on to that which I deserved, I worked hard for, it's mine. And Jesus over and over again is spending time with all those I deserve people. The guy who, has the bumper crop and says, what do I do with all my crops? Well, I'll just build bigger barns because I worked hard for this. My brains. And that's just the block to generosity, right? That doesn't free us from being immersed in this thanksgiving that God has, through which God has given to us so many things that we haven't deserved. So gratitude journal, living life in thanksgiving, and then spending time after Thanksgiving wondering about the creative enterprise of generosity. The creative enterprise of generosity. Again, I think the church can be at fault with this by saying, well, give to the church, write your check out to the church, dump it into the offering basket, and then you're sort of done with that. Not that that isn't important. I think it's very important. Why? Because I think it's a reflection of our values, right? We give because of what we believe strongly about. We give to those organizations that we believe have not only done something for us, but we see those organizations and what they have done, what they are doing for other people. So we stroke that check and we put it into the offering plate because we think, what a shame it would be if we drove down Bee Ridge Road some year and looked over and there was no Church of the Palms on the corner of Lockwood Ridge Road and Bee Ridge Road. I mean, no one wants that, right? So we believe in the institution, we give toward it. But there is this other creative enterprise of giving that allows us to begin to explore how, in fact, we can make a difference in the world. And to become curious about how it is that we can allow the world to become even greater. And in doing so, it's important for us to begin to explore what are the things I'm passionate about? What do I feel strongly about in this world? What do I feel is really important? What do I feel, what do I not want to go away? For me, I've recently done a little birding thing over in the celery fields, and I've really gotten to really be interested in that little part of our world. And so it's gotten me curious about what is it that this place needs that can help make this world a better place. And so the experience is a joyful one because you get to do your own research, you get to explore your own curiosity, you get to talk to people, you get to share passions, and then out of that comes some direction over how it is that you can become the person that God thinks you are by becoming more generous. Not in the effort to be recognized for it. I know some people like to give because they want to be recognized for it. But I think there's so much in just the giving, there's so much joy in just the giving that the recognition doesn't necessarily even need to happen. Remember the great end of, running out of time here. Remember the great end of the story of Les Miserables? How many of you have seen the play or seen the movie? Okay, or read the book? The book is a commitment. It's a good book, but it's a commitment. At the end of the story, when Jean Valjean is growing ill and nearing death, he brings out onto the stage and puts on the table the 2 candlesticks, which were the symbol of his transformation, because those were the candlesticks the bishop pointed to when he had been caught having stolen the rest of the bishop's silver. The bishop turns to the candlesticks and says, "You forgot the candlesticks." He holds on to those candlesticks for the rest of his life. Why? Because they were a symbol of what God had done for him through the bishop. I think there's something to be said for carrying with us the symbols of our gratitude, the symbols of the grace that has been bestowed upon us. And that can be all sorts of things. It can be pictures of people. It can simply be the cross of Jesus that hangs on our necks. Or it can be something else that is very, very, there's, I have a friend of mine who carries an AA token with him all the time, has it in his pocket. And, whatever that year, token was, and he's got that in his pocket. And he reaches and touches the token and says, "Thank God I'm still sober." So putting some kind of symbolism into your life that reminds you of the people or the events or the circumstances you've been in that help you to become the person you think you are. I have to wrap up here. I've got a whole other list of things to talk about. And let me just finish by saying, last is trust. Rosemary Pritchett handed the check back. Why? Because she trusted that doing the right thing was not only who she was, but it was the right thing to do. But she also trusted that somehow God was going to provide. That somehow through one's doing the right thing, through one's generosity, that God would provide. And I personally, I can't say how many times, especially early in my life, where, Amanda and I had to sit down, and we always tried to make the first check of the month to church. That was the first check, not the last check, the first check. If it was the last check, we wouldn't get to it. Honest engine. We always tried to make it the first check. But there was lots of times where we thought, my goodness, are we going to be able to balance this thing? Are we going to be able to get to the necessary last check? And I'm not here to say that pennies fell from heaven. I'm not here to say that all of a sudden a mysterious check appeared in the mail and balanced the checkbook. I haven't had those kinds of experiences. I get wary of those kinds of stories. I think they can be manipulative. But I will tell you that I've never been in want. I never, didn't have food on my table. I never didn't have clothes on my children's backs. There's just so much I had that became for me the symbol of God's providence, God's providing for me in the midst of it. So I think this God who created us, knit us together in our mother's wombs, this God who made us into who we are, this God who's eager for us to experience the joy of generosity, is not going to be the God who lets us down. It's not going to be the God who says, oh, well, tough luck, you got too generous. That's the way it got. Why? Because here's what's happening. Generosity becomes the force now. And then we become more and more convinced that we can live simply so that others can simply live, right? Generosity becomes the force. And when generosity becomes the force, we're not worried about whether we've got the expensive thing, or we're not worried about whether we got the sweater from Goodwill. We're not worried about those things. Why? Because God's going to take care of that, while we get to continue down this wonderful path of generosity, experiencing this joy that God has always intended for us. So that's my hope for you, and my hope is that you truly do become the person your dog thinks you are, but more importantly, that you become the person that God already thinks you are. And the more we live into that, the greater joy we have, and the greater peace we have of doing the right thing. So let me finish us with a word of prayer. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this opportunity to wonder and reflect and to consider what it is that you have made us into. And we thank you, O God, that you give us moments perhaps like this to step away and to wonder, how is it that God is at work in me? And how is it that he has formed me? What gifts and time and talent has he given me? That we can wonder how we can, through our thanksgiving, give to those as others have given to us, and that we can truly participate in the joy that you intend for us all. For we ask it in Christ's name. Amen. Thank you, everybody.